and thanks for joining us on YouTube this evening. My name is Robin Crawshaw. I'm the Reading Development Manager for Lancashire Libraries. And tonight I'm delighted to be here representing the library service in Lancashire in collaboration with Saraband as part of the New Words Festival from Time to Read Northwest. So I'm pleased tonight to be speaking to Donald Esmurray. It's an exciting day, as I'm sure you are all aware. Today is the publication of Donald's new book, In a Veil of Mist, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about the book over the coming hour. You may have also noticed that the book has been declared as the Times' Historical Book of the Month today, which is very exciting news. Congratulations on that, Donald. They've described the book as a moving portrait of a place and its people, a quiet, sad, but brilliant novel. Just before we begin, there's a couple of things to note. There will be an opportunity to have any questions you may have for Donald answered. So please do use the chat function on YouTube in order to ask them. We'll get to them nearer the end of the event, and we'll be making a note of them as they come in. So yeah, if ever anything comes to mind, just pop it in the chat. We're also at the whims of technology tonight, beaming from across Shetland and north of England. So please bear with us if there's any technological issues. Hopefully there won't be anything at all. Finally, as a way of introduction, as we're here to talk to Donald about his new book, I'd like to make you aware that Saraband are running some offers on their online shop, especially for this event. So there will be a link in the chat, but the shop can be found at saraband.net/shop. There's free postage on all of Donald's books, and there's some bundle deals as well where you can get several books for a brilliant price. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Donald. Donald is an award-winning author of 11 books and has written many essays, short stories, and poems. How are you?
Not bad at all. I was also a teacher for 30 years, so I think I better throw that in the equation too. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's an exciting day having a new book out. Should we get started with some questions?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So firstly, I thought I'd ask how you found the last sort of 12 months or however many months it's been that we've been living through a fairly strange old time. Has it been any different for you in terms of writing? Have you found it particularly challenging for your writing, or has it been
I found it very rewarding in a way. I stay in a rural area. I've kind of done an awful lot of walking, listening to birds. I did a short book on that called The Man Who Talks to Birds. That's, I think, the early months of spring. It was almost as if time stopped, and I went back into my childhood where, there were very few cars available in the locality. So I almost, unfortunately, my legs are not strong and fit as they used to be way back then, but I did an awful lot of walking. I did an awful lot of, watching particularly birds. There's an awful lot of seabirds around here, and even otters and seals. This year I didn't spot a whale, but that's a change. Last year I did. But it's been rewarding in a lot of ways, an awful lot of ways, because there's none of the distractions, of normal life, where you had to travel an awful lot.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. So, in a kind of normal time, you'd obviously have routines in your writing and things. Have those routines been pretty much the same, or have you been able to just get on with writing?
I think the routines. I've actually been teaching, and I went back to teaching because I needed help at the local school. So I went back there for a couple of days a week. But before this, I was doing a lot of travel. Previous year I had done an awful lot of travel to book festivals, and unlike those of you who are in middle Lancashire, when I'm traveling, there are occasions when I have to travel on the boat, which is 12 to 14-hour journey from Aberdeen to Shetland, or to flights. And it's amazing how often fog bound. Somebody at the airport might get fog bound, and you end up in Orkney rather than landing in Shetland. So I've been spared these delights. over I'm using that word very ironically.
Yes.
The last year, it's been in some ways quite a pleasant change not to travel.
Okay. So we're obviously here tonight to talk about In a Veil of Mist. Do you want to start by telling us a sort of a brief synopsis of the book?
It's based on an incident way back in 1952, which actually has Lancashire at its heart to some extent. They did tests on biological weapons on a boat called the Ben Lomond off Tulsa Beach, off Tulsa Head, Trivor in Tulsa, on the east side of Lewis. So they spent most of the year in 1952 doing that, testing bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, various other gases on monkeys and guinea pigs. And that was the first year. The second year, it was all part of something they called Pandora. They also did tests in the Bahamas. They did 2 sets of tests in the northwest of Scotland. One of them was the Operation Cauldron, which is the centre of my book. The other one was the following year. It was Operation Hesperus, which is the Flannan Isles was partly also at the centre of that. I know a lot of people will know who the Flannan Isles are because it's the centre of every spurious lighthouse keeper's story that you can come across. So there's that. That, and what actually happened was a boat called the Karela from Fleetwood in Lancashire, for some reason, ignored all the warnings. And when it was going up into Icelandic waters, it actually ended up in the middle of I think it was bubonic plague, I think it was pneumonic plague actually, when they were spraying that. And no matter how often they waved a flag and sounded bells, the crew of the Karela didn't take notice of what was going on. I think they must have been just going up the Minch, which is a narrow strait of water. So that's the basis of the story, kind of crisis, caused by that on the boat to Ben Lomond, and because there was a danger almost like at present time. And I find it very strange. I've been thinking of this for years and years and years, there was the danger of the plague spreading through, places like Fleetwood and Lancashire, and also, obviously Blackpool and the whole area. And they followed the fishermen for quite some time. They kept an eye in case they spread the plague. There was nothing about nowadays. They weren't going to give them a job or keep them in isolation. They just kept an eye on them. Fortunately, we were lucky in a lot of ways in that the aerosol sprays they were using for these tests didn't work. So we were very, very fortunate in that. Otherwise, you could have had, a dreadful, it could have been a pandemic, as great as the one that's going today. But it was so serious that, the Prime Minister at that time, well, it's actually Rob Butler, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, because Churchill wasn't, I think, quite with us in 1952. He might have been in office physically, but they were aware of this, the danger of this pandemic affecting the whole of the northwest of England.
It's terrifying to think that it was just so close to being an utter disaster. Obviously, the kind of the issue around a pandemic being is something that for so many years it's not something that we think about, and then various things come about, and obviously we're in that period at the minute where it's just so front and center. With it being something that you planned to write for a long time,
it was. It's rather. When I did start before the pandemic, actually, it was created. It had been kind of bubbling away in my head, and I started, I think, at the end of November before the pandemic actually took place. I can actually prove that. I sent emails. I sent emails to people with my plan at that time, but it came. What actually sparked off the story was a little report in our local newspaper it's called the Astronomy Gazette, and there was a wee report there about a man committing a breach of the peace who had been one of the crew on the Ben Lomond. And he had stolen a car, he had wrecked very strange things in law-abiding Stornoway at that time. Stornoway was an incredibly law-abiding place. I thought, well, that's a great idea for a story. That's a great idea for a story. And I filed it away. I'd also asked our former MP, Colin MacDonald, I'd quizzed him. He had asked questions and I had comments about it. And I'd quizzed him, quite assiduously about it, trying to make sure that this, get the detail. And he knew very little. He knew just about the same as the rest of it. But the reason we know anything at all, of course, is linked to the General Belgrano story, which is also a rather peculiar connection. It was, I've just forgotten his name, it was the same person who leaked the General Belgrano story to the press that leaked the Operation Cauldron story. It was very, very different because Clive Ponting it was. So Clive Ponting linked the story. He found this crumpled file when he was, and then he discovered references to this biological testing, which it wasn't just the UK government that involved, the Americans and the Canadians were also involved. And he leaked it to the Observer at that time. And that's how we know, from that really slight document, that's how we know that this incident happened. Apart from, as part of the folklore of people too, in the area.
So when was the first time that it sort of came across your, first time you heard about it?
I think, way back, despite my youthful appearance, probably about 50 years ago, when I heard about it I think it was in the school hostel. We all stayed in hostels because we were 24. I was stayed 24 miles out from town, and everybody who stayed at that kind of distance, rather than traveling in, fairly at that time fairly narrow, twisting woods, we would stay in the school hostel from Monday to Friday. And I think it was there I heard the story first of all. I also have relatives in the village of Tulster. My father had first cousins there, and it was quite a close-knit family. We saw quite a lot of them. In fact, one of my uncles looked almost identical to this man over in Tulsa. It's very strange how similar they looked. So I heard the story from them too. So I think it was a combination of sources.
So you mentioned that you'd sort of been sitting on the idea for a while. What's the kind of usual process for you when you are writing a book? Is there a lot of research, or is it something that you do mull over?
I researched. Now, the previous book I did, which was about probably when there was the worst peacetime tragedy that's affected these islands, was the Islair disaster, when men at the end of the First World War, coming home to Lewis, the 208 of them died, almost on the shoreline of Stornoway, which is a huge effect. You're talking about a small rural population, which has already lost more men per head of population than any other part of the British Isles in the conflict. So that one needed a lot of kind of intense researching, because so much was known, and I was terrified I would get a few facts wrong.
Yeah.
And I think, again, given the scale of the tragedy, this one had a lot more freedom to it. You know, I even, you know, things that I sometimes used slight untruths as metaphors. You know, that I've got, for instance, um, the bus driver who was spent his wartime in Gibraltar, and there were all these lights, you know, around Gibraltar because it was, you know, to keep the enemy away. And he compares that to the lighthouses in Tulsa, you know, that kind of thing. So these slight exaggerations like that, I permitted myself the luxury of these in this one.
I think,
but it did involve a lot of research.
Yeah, I think you're allowed to do that. Have that little poetic license.
That's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah.
Just like the Flandern Isles again.
So tonight I'm talking to you on behalf of Lancashire Libraries, and as you mentioned before, there is a connection in the book and in the story to Lancashire with the boat, the Corella, and its links to Fleetwood. Without giving too much away about the plot of the story, could you explain a bit more about how Lancashire is connected into this story?
Well, first of all, I actually wrote a poem about the story years ago, and it was published in a book called S.Y. Story. And I made the central character a Geordie. And then I thought to myself, actually, it makes much more sense, dramatic sense, if I make him come from Lancashire. So Liverpool and his girlfriend has Fleetwood connections. So he's the central character. He's a guy called John Herod, and he's a scientist working on the boat, the Ben Lomond, checking out the effects that the poison has had on these animals that have been killed, cutting up the spleen. You know, not very pleasant work. And he undergoes he suffers a moral crisis because his wife, who's the Fleetwood girl, objects to his line of work anyway. So that's a central story. There's actually 3 stories running in close conjunction. That's one of them.
So it seems to be a common thing between both of our respective areas being sort of off the coast of Lancashire and Lancashire and off the coast of mainland Scotland, that there's a prevalence of what you might call dirty industries, nuclear submarines, fracking, radioactive waste. Is that something that you're particularly conscious of, that you want to highlight in your work, or do you think it is a good narrative device?
Yes. And the area I actually wrote about, I had the guy who's a central character who used to work at Sutton Oak, which is St. Helens, I think. It's that area in the north, which is where they tested out mustard gas. And there were a huge number of accidents and deaths in St. Helens relating to the use of mustard gas. There was a cylinder washed up, for instance, Fleetwood was washed up in Fleetwood, at the time. So there is that record of in that part of the world. Now, clearly, there's the Windscale Sellafield story to the nuclear industry there, and as you said yourself, fracking in recent times. So they do seem to have that in common, the northwest of Scotland and northwest of England, that they have been almost traditionally used for these kind of activities. That's true about other parts of the United Kingdom. You were also talking about Devon and things there. So it's not exclusive to these 2 areas, but there's a high propensity of these kind of activities would happen in these areas, which Boris Johnson's fabled bridge between Northern Ireland and Scotland is going to run slap bang into some of the wreckage that's been left in that particular part of the coastline. So that at that part of the world. So there's that. I would argue that some of the ones that were in. There's also other links. Another place in the northwest of Scotland, near Alt Bay, or Wester Ross area, beautiful part of the world, Robin. I don't know if you've ever travelled up north. It is spectacularly beautiful part of the world. Gairloch area, that part of Wester Ross is. I mean, I've travelled, I think, most of these islands, and I think, yeah, it's probably number one or number two. Probably number one, actually. All the locations I've travelled in. But they had a particular incident in Grenard Island, which is off Ott Bay, which happened in 1942, where they used this as the basis of anthrax testing. And that had a hideous effect on Ott Bay. And I have a character with connection to Ott Bay in the story. Because they bombed the area with anthrax. They literally bombed. What they did was to put sheep up, and then they put them. It's a Gaelic word. It's amazing when it comes to crofting words. I always come. They fastened their tide there. Then they were testing the effects of wind direction of anthrax and how the fatalities of the sheep. And as a result, that ground became absolutely contaminated with it. Now, peculiarly, many decades later, when I think Margaret Thatcher was in charge of the Conservative Party, there had been, constant campaigns to clean up Grenard Island. And then this rather extreme Scottish nationalist group, who I can't recall, decided to leave contaminated soil at Blackpool Tower, where the conference was being held, from Grenard Island, which clearly caused mass panic among Conservative politicians, particularly, I would imagine. So that is another event that kind of connects the two places, or connects my book with the northwest of England. I certainly would not have approved what they did, by no means. I better point that out very quickly. But it was, there had been a number of these, and I actually think the Grenard case was an absolute disgrace. It was worse than the Operation Cauldron because it left a long-term legacy. But you can go, nuclear submarines, you had incidents off the sky, to the same, I suppose, it's also true in Lancashire, northwest Lancashire, Barrow-in-Furness, isn't it? That
Yes, technically Cumbria, I think, but
yeah, it's technical Cumbria. Oh, yes, okay. So Barrow-in-Furness has had these incidents. I found it fascinating. I found the research fascinating because it seemed to me that no country was innocent. All the countries in Western Europe were up to it. Italy being possibly the worst example under Mussolini when they bombed what was then Abyssinia or Ethiopia. But the Weimar Republic, which is always regarded as one of these holier than thou places, worked together with the Soviet Union to develop Novichok. That's where it started, hidden in Russia. It's a really curious alliance between the Weimar Republic and this. So every country was up to it. So I can understand, in a way, why the British government and the Americans did this kind of thing. I don't, if you put it in the context of the time and the fears of the time, I can see there's an argument for it. I don't necessarily agree with that argument, but it's if every country is behaving in that way, then perhaps you have no choice but to follow.
Yeah, it was an arms race, wasn't it?
It was an arms race.
True sense of the word in the phrase.
Yes, yeah. And it was after, of course, the other context we have is, it's after I just mean Nagasaki and Hiroshima, so
Yeah,
it's after that too.
yeah.
That's the other context.
Scary time. Yeah,
Very scary times.
yeah.
Absolutely scary times. Fear was bred into the bones of people at that time.
Mm.
No question of that.
So it seems to me that you seem very keen to celebrate, if that's the right word, the way of life of the people in the Hebridean Islands, and to talk about what life is like in those communities. So could you tell us a little bit about what those communities are like and how that impacts on your writing?
I think one of the things that I think impacts on my writing is the fact that I'm bilingual. I have two languages. And I do think there are advantages, huge advantages in being bilingual, in that it gives you a distance. When I'm writing English, I'm not saying I'm Joseph Conrad. I would not claim that great honor for myself, but you write in a way that distances you from the language. So there was that. That was part of my that's part of my thinking. That was part of my thinking. So I also, it was a fairly poor background, but in fact it was a poor background. Economically it was very, very poor. Crofting, we had about 8.5 acres of land, which wasn't of great quality, but it was better actually than most. Now we grew turnips and potatoes and various things like that. But there was an essential decency about people. Did I lock my door during my whole childhood years in growing up in Ness and Nether Lewis? I don't think I even knew what the key was, to be honest. You could trust your neighbours. You could trust your neighbours. So there was an essential decency about people. They would, needless to say, like in any small community, they would dart your back occasionally with the edges of their tongues. But that's I'm afraid that's the nature of a small community. But essentially, people were fairly decent. That most of them were very kind and loving and gentle. So
you mentioned that you use that you're bilingual,
yes.
and that you do use some Gaelic in your writing. Is that something that it's just the way that the characters need to speak for you, or do you think it's important to highlight that language to an audience?
Yeah, I think too that well, I do think it's very important to highlight that distinctiveness of the language. It's that in the sense there are how many native tongues in these islands. Certainly it's Irish, which is fairly close to ours. Welsh. There was Cornish at one time. There was Scots. I better not mention all of them because I'll get into trouble by naming somebody out. But I think it's really important to have that kind of linguistic variety. I think it helps people to think differently. I think if we all come from the same tongue, we all use the same idioms, we all use the same metaphors, we all tend to think the same. And I think it's really important to have a variety of thought. Now we've seen that, in the last few years, with the Blackish and the BAME community have brought an incredible richness to, particularly English literature, I would argue, and also Scottish. So I think that is, that's been remarkable because it gives another perspective on the world, and we, I think, can provide that too.
So just one more question before we move on to a bit of a reading from the book. Is there anything that you're currently working on that you would like to share? Have you got any plans for what comes next?
I'm working on. I've got a big commission which was meant to be published last October, but the pandemic, slowed it down. Which is on lighthouses. I grew up within the vision of the Butterlewis Lighthouse. Where it used to flash daily at me when I was growing up. I also stayed for a while in the East, where the Monohyros Lighthouse. If I look out my window here in Shetland, I can see the Bressa Lighthouse just literally twinkling in the window. So I was commissioned by Historic Environment Scotland and the Northern Lighthouse Board to write a book about lighthouses, which has been, I have to say, one of the most detailed and exhausting that I have ever done. It's been incredibly demanding, but the quality, for instance, of the work, the quality of the photos, it's going to be one of these marvelous works of art, and I'm not talking about my own writing there. I'm talking about, some of the pictures, go back up to the turn of, 1909 to 1913, and have never been seen in public before, or at least in book form. So it's an amazing book. I think it's going to be a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to that coming out. I'm also working on novels too, but that's I need to keep the two balls up in the air.
Excellent. That sounds great. So thank you very much. That was fantastic. So before we get to audience questions, I think you did say that, that you are okay to do a bit of a reading from the book. Yeah. So if you're okay, could you give us a bit of context for that and start? And whilst you're doing the reading, I'm going to also, if the technology allows it, load up some photographs that you shared with me before.
This is the beach. This is of Trivor in Tulsa, which is a thoroughly beautiful part of the world.
Yeah. So credit to these.
Much better than looking at me.
Let me just see if I can. There we go.
Okay. Well, no, that's the later ones. Have you got the ones, earlier ones of the beach? Have you got the? That's the ones I want.
There we go.
Yeah, that's the earlier one. Now, this is one of the characters, Jessie, who is a spinster living in the village. I will use that word spinster. I know it's slightly old-fashioned, but she wanders. She does an awful lot of the time wandering the village. She picks up, the flowers that are, growing. She uses them as medicine, which a lot of people did. So this is her going to the beach that we're seeing there at the moment. It was a dead fish, she noticed first. The silvery skin of ling, a clutch of goldfish tangled among seaweed, other fish stranded on the sand, too many to be normal or natural. Jessie had stood there for ages watching them, bemused by their arrival on the shore. And then there was a day a couple of seals were washed up, stretched out on the edge of the tide, their flesh squabbled over by gulls, torn and shredded. She had never seen anything quite like it in all the years she had stepped on either Gary Beach or the Tide Over, looking for flotsam that Minch had washed up in the tide. Things like nets swept from the deck of a fishing boat, a shattered tree trunk that might have floated in their direction from one of the rivers in the Highlands. Even once, a thick Guernsey stripped perhaps from a fisherman's back. These gifts from the sea were always useful. A net could be draped over the top of a haystack. Timber might be used for a roof or even to weigh down a stack of oats or hay. A Guernsey could be washed and mended, given to one of the many bachelors in the village. They were always in need of clothes, and they sometimes had no woman in their lives to help provide them. A few hours and a click of knitting needles at the fireside and a quick repair could be done. Clothing provided that would keep them warm in winter. But the fish and seals were strange. The fact that they had shoaled up dead on the beach in such numbers, the way too there hadn't been a storm a night or two before, as there so often was on this edge of the coastline, bringing all sorts of arrivals to the coast. I don't know whether to carry on from that point, but I think that's old. But this is, she goes there, and this is where she begins to notice there are strange things happening to her world. Again, see, in English, you would call this a Jersey, and peculiarly in both Scots dialect and Gaelic, it's a Guernsey. It's from Guernsey rather than Jersey. Obviously it was the Guernsey fishermen who are more often seen there. So that's a Guernsey. That's a Jersey. It's a Guernsey. But I started off with her story. I'm seeing somebody, Sue Lawson is saying there, it's a Guernsey in Whitby too, obviously. So that's straight. So that she goes there and she discovers there's something up, and then a short time later she discovers the monkeys washed up on the beach and the guinea pigs, and she's never seen either of these creatures before, and in a sense that's very disorientating.
Not necessarily native to beaches.
Not necessarily native to beaches at all, no. It takes it, and of course that also brings the Gibraltar angle into the story, because clearly the man who's the bus driver, Duncan, who actually trained to become a bus driver while working alongside the Black Watch in Gibraltar, he can identify monkeys. He knows what they have. So there's a difference between the two.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was great. We have got some questions, so if anyone does still have any questions that they want to send across, then do so now, and we'll try and get those answered. But we'll start with so the first one is from Richard. Donald, thank you for your time. Why do you think this story isn't well known? Was it classified in any way?
It was classified. Clearly, the fact that we only know of this, a lot of the details of the story, as I say, by chance. If Clive Ponting hadn't discovered the file, hadn't handed it over to the Observer, we would not know what had happened. And one of the fleet, the sons of one of the fleet, of the men who had been in the Canella, actually emailed me. And I cannot remember his name at the moment, and I apologize for that. He emailed me and he said the first his father knew about the incident was after the questions had been asked in the House of Commons, and of Donald Stewart, who was Western Isles MP, relating to the story in the Observer. And the BBC cameraman came up and started asking questions, and they had no idea what they were on about, none whatsoever. So it was covered up, like so much, I think, at that time, because it was illegal what the British, the UK, the Canadian, and the US governments were doing at that time. It was an illegal act. So they weren't exactly going to broadcast that this had taken place. The locals were actually told, I've heard this recently, that they were told that the experiments were to help them work out an antidote to, tests on these animals. That's untrue. Everything I've read, nothing I've read indicates that that was the case. But, it's part of the folklore, and there's a great deal of folklore about it. People genuinely believe that's what they were doing.
It's convenient.
It's convenient in the interest of everyone to believe it. Yeah.
Thank you. So a question from Colin. Donald, you've written many works of non-fiction, so why fiction for this subject, and indeed for As the Woman Lay Dreaming? Does it humanise it?
It's humanizing. In some ways, fiction is truer than fact. I think it's Colin. I think that's fact. You have to cut down on your knowledge of human emotions and how human beings would react to a particular situation. So I remember, when I was growing up, I would say to you in Gaelic, Connor Yevikin Diakonashin, why are you reading these lies? When you were sometimes reading a storybook, and you would think to yourself, well, in a sense, there's possibly just as many lies in factual books as it is. I think this one lent itself, both books lent itself to a certain extent. I always wanted to write a book on the Lair disaster. It was central to importance for me. I knew it had a huge effect on the community, that I had been a part of, for all these men to come home at the end of a war and to, die on their own doorsteps. It's an appalling, it's an unthinkable thing to happen. But I knew that, that you would have to be, because the ones who died in that ship, by and large, about 95% of them were all Gaelic-speaking crofters. You would have to be somebody who came from that ilk to truly understand the effect of the community. So that's why I wrote the Ireland book. I was very conscious there was a responsibility on someone to tell that story, and I didn't see too many around who fitted the description. We would be able to do it. So I was very conscious of that, and it needed to be told, not in a factual way, but in a way that spoke about the effects of that tragedy on the community. This was different. Here was a book that, in a sense, was a mystery, and I had always been told that the ship was going back to Fleetwood when they went into the Spray. In fact, it wasn't. It was going to Iceland. It was, in some ways, the citizens of Reykjavik were also under threat from the poisonous spray. Lots of other stories. I was told, for instance, that they had to kill off cattle in the Uig in Skye, which is north end of Skye, because brucellosis had been left loose among the cattle there. I heard so many stories over the years that were untrue, but it seemed to me that I could make use of these untruths in a novel form, and in a sense, try and help people find out the truth of what has occurred. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense, yeah. It does. So I've got another question from Colin here. Something I always meant to ask. Norman Malcolm MacDonald's novel based on Stornoway referred to it as Portrona. What is the origin of that?
I knew Norman well. I would say that there were about two or three people. Two or three people had effect on me as a young writer. He used to take me into his office when I was about 16, 17. Because he wanted to encourage my writing, so it was great. But I think Portrona has been around Stornoway for a long time. I wonder if it's to do with the island of North Forna, which is part of my own native parish, which is the nearest place in Scotland to the Faroe Islands. Everybody in Shetland thinks it's Shetland. No, it's not. It's part of my native parish. It's just slightly nearer to the Faroe Islands, so it's very far north. So I wonder if that's the reason, that just Portrona and somebody made up that. I think it was a book called Boomses of Portrona, and now I'm thinking that, and that's a fictional name for Stornoway.
So a question from Sue. I really enjoyed the old stories like The Blue Men of Minch. does Donald think those types of stories are still told to children, and it would be sad to lose them?
I think rarely. I think there will be the odd person who tell their children stories about the Blue Men of the Minch. I probably heard more about the Blue Men of the Minch from reading English language books than I ever heard at my own fireside. If you're talking about the folklore of our place, we seem to have a passion for vanishing lights. Lights seen on roadsides. There was meant to be a ghost at the edge of the village, where the Ness Hall came to be built, which we would call Callach an Threich, which would be the old woman of Heather Ridge, I think would be an adequate translation. So we had an awful lot of ghost stories, had an awful lot of religious stories too, that you had some sort of miracle that was sent to, even in a local context. There was a lot of storytelling, and I think particularly in my village, I mean, I think my village has got the highest density of writers virtually in the whole of the British Isles. I was talking about Gaelic English and also, songwriters in the past too. So there was that tradition in my village in particular. I'm not saying it wasn't elsewhere, but, it seemed to be particularly strong in my village. There's three brothers who were very, very good in the previous, about 20 years older than me, who were all, number of writers, number of books, including English books. That's Campbell. Sorry, Campbell brothers is what I got to say.
Okay. Another question from Colin. You mentioned the virtues of bilingualism. Would you consider writing only in Gaelic, as others have done?
No, because my Gaelic grammar is not wonderful. I struggle with it. I find that I have a son and a daughter, and particularly my son, I think, is probably better at writing Gaelic than I am. I think it was certainly when I was in school, we had not yet emerged from the kind of generation that when it was discouraged. I always my grandfather's generation, there used to be a wooden boat around your neck if you found speaking Gaelic in the playground. In my father recalled being belted for speaking Gaelic on one occasion, at least one occasion. And I think there was still that attitude, when I was growing up, which is less so, thankfully, now. I remember an old man from the village say, "They ain't Gaelic in the year." What did Gaelic ever do for us? And he says, "Had to get carga for it never gave us anything." No, sorry. Had to get carga in Dungarees at the Leitch for. It never gave us anything except dungarees and cold porridge. So I think that attitude was still there to an extent, in my time. And I think particularly in the hostel, it was stronger. It was almost as if all these country boys, when they went into the Strawberry hostel, they thought it was a matter of sophistication to shed what knowledge of Gaelic they had. So, yes. I think there was. Thankfully, that attitude is now gone. Really good.
Yes. So we've got a question from Saraband. How did they keep the risk of deadly infection secret from the Fleetwood trawlermen?
They just followed them. They put there was a fishery protection vessel followed them all the way up to Iceland. Several other Ministry of Defence vessels. They followed them, and then when they arrived back in Fleetwood, as I say, there were people who were actually paid to follow them there. So that's how they did it. That's how they did it. I think one of the great blessings is this whole idea of aerosol sprays was, according to their own findings, even a year later, it was shown not to work. I think we that is the greatest blessing of all. That otherwise you would have had serious problems. There's no doubt in my mind in Lancashire as a result of the Kerala incident.
So we've got a question from Dancing Fee. Hello, Donald. Once we are free to travel, would you consider a visit to Lancashire? It would be lovely to see you and hear you in person. From Fiona and Donna.
That's for my sisters. So, yes, of course, I would love to go and see them. It'd be lovely to see them down there. I have family connections with West Horton near Bolton, just outside. I think I mentioned that to you in there. So I have family and I would love to see them. And I love the way they call themselves Dancing Feet, however. But I know that's true. I know that they've got greater dancing skills than I have. So.
We have got one more question just come in. This is from Jerry. You celebrate all that is wonderful about Scotland, the people, nature and the language. Do you think belonging to an island community gives a clearer perspective on man's interference in nature?
Yeah, it's something I get more and more concerned about. Somebody asked earlier, I think, about I saw it flashing out about non-fiction books, and one I wrote about recently was called The Dark Stuff, published by Bloomsbury, and it was about that very thing I used to hate when I was a young lad. We used to have to go out and cut peat for the fire, and our whole summers were taken up with providing peat for the fire. And you'd go out and you'd cut it. Well, you'd stuff it, you would cut it, you would go back, you would lift it, you would put it into sort of pyramids. Actually, it looks more like pies, that pie symbol. But then you would lift it, you would gather it up again, then you put it in a wheelbarrow, and then you would take it home. And that was your summer. That was your summer holiday. That was, an awful lot of your summer was taken up by that. And I suppose at the time, and even coming from Mel Lewis today, I kind of devalued peat. It was something that was there, and something which I partly hated. But I know, I went to, when I was in the course of writing that book, I went to places like Netherlands where they had destroyed all their peat completely. And, the knock-on effect of that on their environment was, of course, flooding, etc., etc. I went to Germany where it had been, peat cutting was used as a kind of punishment. In fact, all the first concentration camps were basically peat cutting camps. So that my attitude changed quite dramatically to peat. It's now something I value, and I think I'm aware of its importance. I don't know if coming from an island does that. I think perhaps moving away from the island and then returning to it is actually what it does. I think what's on your doorstep, we don't really value anymore a lot of the time. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this. I think everyone in the audience would agree it's been really enjoyable and informative. And personally, I'd also like to. We got some feedback there. So yeah, I'd just personally like to wish you all the best for the launch of the book. I hope it's incredibly successful for you. It deserves to be.
Okay, tapolage. In Gaelic, I'm gymaint painful a bit show. No, I'm on 3 coming here from Lancashire, working here. So I'm thanking you very much and saying it's not often I'm down in Lancashire on Thursday night in March. So thank you very much for
thank you.
Taking me.
I think Sue's gonna pop back in now.
Yeah. Sure.
Or not. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, tonight. This has been part of the Time to Read New Words Festival, in conjunction with Lancashire Libraries and Saraban Books. Thank you very much to Donald S. Murray. As we mentioned at the beginning, his new book, In a Veil of Mist, is available from all good bookshops, but you can get it from saraband.net/shop. There's free shipping on Donald's books at the minute, and there are some bundle deals available as well. And we'll also be having copies in Lancashire Libraries as well. So thanks very much.
I've just jumped back in here to say thank you to you as well, Robin, for that really interesting interview, and to add our thanks to Donald. I've jumped in from the publisher, so thank you very much, and to Sue for having us at the New Words Festival. It's been a really interesting chat.
Yes, very different from last night, but it's been lovely. It's been really warm and friendly, and it's been a pleasure to be in Lancashire. Spiritually, if not physically. Yeah.